All right, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack the geopolitical realities of the 2026 US-Iran peace memo. We are looking at a genuinely fascinating situation right now. A place where international relations, completely failed war goals, and just massive financial incentives are all colliding head-on. Today, we're going to map out what was actually expected going into this, what was ultimately signed, and how this specific deal is sending literal shockwaves across the entire Middle East.
To do this, we'll systematically break down the immediate terms of the deal before zooming out. We're looking at the cash for peace gamble, stated aims versus actual outcomes, financials versus regional influence, Israel's strategic disappointment, and finally, how Gulf nations are completely shifting their strategies.
So, let's kick things off with Section 1, the cash for peace gamble.
The source here argues that this entire deal operates on one very specific, incredibly high-stakes hypothesis. Basically, having completely failed to defeat Iran with military force, the U.S. is now testing if it can achieve its goals through sheer financial leverage. The question this analysis poses is pretty blunt. Can you actually use bribes where bombs failed? The memo essentially amounts to the promise of extraordinary sums of money for Iran as long as the U.S. is satisfied that they've abandoned any plans for a nuclear weapon. And because the current U.S. administration is depicted as not really prioritizing democratic reforms, the regime in Tehran is being presented with an unprecedented opportunity to simply trade its nuclear ambitions for cash and investment.
Moving on to Section 2, stated aims versus actual outcomes.
The analysis points out a stark contrast here, noting that the major war aims were entirely ditched in the final text. I mean, think about the original goals. They were sweeping, right? Enact regime change, provide relief for Iran's oppressed citizens, severely limit their ballistic missiles, and halt all support of regional proxy groups. But then you look at the reality of the memo, and none of that materialized. The deal leaves the regime totally in place, and those missiles and proxy forces completely untouched. It's a pretty fascinating pivot in international relations where that initial super aggressive posture has been almost entirely walked back in the final paperwork. Honestly, how often do you see massive war aims just completely evaporate at the negotiating table?
To really understand this geopolitical shift, we have to look closely at a major choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. The deal zeroes in heavily on this specific geographic location, and the source notes that the situation right here lays bare what it describes as the foolishness of the war and the U.S. climb down. Now you might be wondering, why does this matter to us? Well, because whatever happens in this specific waterway impacts the price of nearly everything you and I buy every single day.
The source highlights the shift in control as a crystal-clear illustration of the shifting power dynamics on the water. Before this conflict even began, maritime vessels enjoyed totally free and open passage through the strait. But the new reality dictated by this peace memo is kind of striking. After a 60-day period outlined in the deal, vessels might actually have to pay a fee just to pass through. By weaponizing the strait, Iran has seemingly secured a very tangible long-term geopolitical and economic advantage right there on the water.
That brings us to Section 3, financials versus regional influence. Let's talk about the money, because the financial incentives here are massive. They begin with the immediate unfreezing of tens of billions of dollars in assets. Furthermore, Iran is permitted to immediately begin exporting oil and its derivatives again. For a regime that the source notes is actually quite unpopular at home right now, this massive, sudden influx of cash is an incredibly appealing lifeline.
And it doesn't stop there. This brilliantly illustrates the compounding effect of the package, which includes helping create a massive reconstruction and development fund. Basically, if the talks progress favorably, the U.S. will lift sanctions and assist in establishing a fund worth at least $300 billion. Let me repeat that, $300 billion. That is an incredibly lucrative carrot being dangled at the negotiating table.
However, the source argues that Iran's hardliners have actually given up almost nothing, preferring the regional prestige and protection that comes from opposing the U.S. When we put these concessions side by side, the imbalance is kind of glaring. The U.S. gives up frozen assets, backs a $300 billion fund, and, crucially, plans to pull American troops out within 30 days. That severely limits future U.S. military options. And in return, Iran promises not to get a bomb, which, by the way, is an old promise. They agreed to downblend their enriched uranium, and they vaguely say they will discuss the rest of the program. The source notes that Iran's hardline leaders have no real reason to trust America, and they actually derive their coveted regional influence from being our adversary. So, the analysis suggests Iran's leaders might just take the money while using the sheer complexity of nuclear inspections to string the international community along, essentially trying to have their yellow cake and eat it too.
Let's move on to Section 4, Israel's strategic disappointment.
The analysis characterizes this entire outcome as a bitter disappointment for Israel. They really tested U.S. limits and ultimately found them lacking. Remember, Israel heavily advocated for this war and fought shoulder to shoulder alongside American forces. Yet, according to the source, the U.S. president entirely cut Israel out of the actual peace negotiations. This has directly undermined Israel's own ongoing military campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the domestic political fallout? It's significant. The text notes this perceived strategic failure could very well cost Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu his re-election in October.
So this leaves Israel in a highly vulnerable position, where their entire approach to regional security just has to be totally rewritten. The core issue for Israel here is that the war was a strategic failure, because Iran absolutely remains a potent threat. Israel pushed the U.S. to see exactly how far they were willing to go to neutralize that threat, and the answer they got was not far enough for Israel to prevail. So what comes next? Well, whatever government takes power next in Israel is going to be forced right back to the drawing board to figure out how to survive in this deeply uncertain, completely new reality.
And finally, Section 5, Gulf Nations Shift Security Strategies.
Look, with U.S. reliability suddenly in question, Gulf states are facing an acute survival dilemma in an incredibly violent neighborhood. These countries rely heavily on their reputation as stable havens of prosperity to keep their economies booming. But the reality, as the source bluntly states, is that Iranian drones and ballistic missiles will continue to pose a daily threat left completely unchecked by this peace memo. While building new pipelines that entirely bypass the Strait of Hormuz will certainly help economically, the fundamental security architecture of the Gulf has to be completely overhauled. Why? Because right now, nobody really knows if America will actually be willing to fight for them in the future. The source maps out three very divergent paths these nations are now taking to try and secure their borders and their economies. First, you have some states, like the United Arab Emirates, who might seek even closer, stronger ties with Israel to build a unified deterrent against Iran. Second, other Gulf nations might take the exact opposite approach, attempting to directly accommodate and just appease Iran to avoid becoming targets. And third, some states will likely try to thread the needle, steering a highly cautious neutral path right between Israel and Iran. It's a total fragmentation of regional security strategy, and it's born entirely out of necessity. So what does this all mean? We'll leave you with this really provocative thought from the source. Assuming your opponent thinks exactly as you do might just be the ultimate failure in diplomacy. The analysis concludes by arguing that the U.S. based its entire exit strategy on the belief that the Iranian regime would do absolutely anything for money. But, as we've seen, ideological power, regional prestige, and deep historical grievances very often outweigh financial incentives in international relations. If the U.S. projected its own transactional motivations onto a deeply complex regional power, well, this multi-billion-dollar gamble may ultimately collapse. It's a fascinating look at the very real limits of financial diplomacy. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the realities behind the headlines.